Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. F. Scott Field, and I've got with me today a very special guest, TJ Fry, who will get into a whole lot of topics here that I'm excited about. But it's stuff that I think is relative for professors, for students, for anybody who's just looking to learn better and to think better and to use their mind at a much deeper level than we are all currently using it. So, TJ, thank you so much, man, for being here and for coming on the show. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your academic journey and how it's kind of led you to where you are today.
Yeah, well, first of all, Scott, thank you for having me, man. Really excited to be here and share some of this stuff that I find fascinating with people that are open-minded and interested in learning more about themselves. So really appreciate that opportunity to speak to a great audience. Um, my background is kind of all over the map, so I'll keep it short as possible. But I was a military brat, so born in Hawaii, and then lived most of my young life in Colorado. Went to school in Montana, Montana State University Bozeman, where I got a degree in film. I was a competitive skier, so I'm a professional skier for a while. After that part of my life, I moved to Hollywood and worked in Southern California for about a year in the film industry. Was not for me. Got a lot out of it, but just decided the big city living was not for me. I'm more of a country boy, if you will. And then had a number of businesses over the years, one of which was driving professionally. So I raced cars for a living and trained, law enforcement, military, special operations units, as well as high performance drivers, Travis Pastrana, Ken Block, names that a lot of people might know. So I had a lot of fun in those areas, but the through line for me is that my father was a surgeon, so I grew up in a medical household and was always fascinated with the mind specifically. So I don't know what kind of 9-year-old decides that they want to be a brain surgeon, but that was me. And I've always been fascinated by the mind and how human beings think and how we process information. And so I had a business, I had a painting company in the trades up here in Montana, and I knew that I had some issues with finances without going into details. And so I found an event from somebody I trust very much down in Austin. Went to this event with basically the approach of, okay, I don't care what they tell me to do, but for me to accomplish my financial goals within this business, I'm going to do whatever they tell me to do. So I had released unknowingly, I had released attachment to a specific outcome. I just cared about getting the results. It didn't matter to me how I achieved them. And so through this event, I learned about neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, which I just absolutely fell in love with. And so, as is the case in many situations in my life, the best things in my life have showed up when I was not actively searching for them. And so, learning about NLP, I dove down that rabbit hole. I got certified as a practitioner, then a master practitioner, now a certified NLP trainer. And that comes along with certifications in timeline therapy to those levels, as well as hypnosis and a number of other modalities as well. And so this has basically been just an incredible case study for me as I delve more and more into the coaching world, working one-on-one with clients, as well as businesses. I do consulting for businesses that's largely mindset based, and I tied my results to their results, or my payment, if you will, to their results. So that's been pretty fascinating, and I'm moving into in-person events as well. So it's really just blossomed into this beautiful thing where I get to communicate with incredibly brilliant people who are willing to be vulnerable and open, and help them achieve results that they maybe never anticipated to be possible, simply by understanding how they think. I want to be clear, none of this is about what you're thinking. I'm not a mind reader. I'd never claimed to be. But the idea here is that processes and patterns can be studied by anybody willing to take the time to look for them and then implement them within your own life to be able to achieve similar results.
Yeah, I love that, man. That ties in with exactly what we're trying to do with the Metacognition of Leadership Institute, right? We're trying to show people how to think, right? Metacognition simply is just thinking about thinking, right? And we need to do more of that. We need to think more about how we think. Like you said, it's not so much a matter of what you think, but how the brain actually works, right? And how we can tap into some of that and elevate our thinking so that we can get better performance out of our everyday lives even, right? It's not even just about, teaching or learning. It's not about, running a business or any of that. It's just if you can really stop and think about you and how you think and what you understand, it goes a long way. And I mean, my business really started taking off the last 2 years or so when I stopped saying yes to everything and piling more on my plate and just started saying no and stopping and pausing and thinking about thinking and which levers I had to pull to get the best outcomes and results, right? Just like you said. So today, we're going to dive into a little bit of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, but let's start off with just neuro-linguistic programming. Let's start with NLP. Give us
Yeah,
a brief
absolutely.
overview of that because we're going to be talking about that more in the upcoming months. So, introduce our audience to NLP for me, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. It's a pretty fascinating field that was developed by two individuals, Bandler and Grinder, back in the 70s largely. There's been a lot of these techniques that have taken place, of course, well before it was an established field. So it's not necessarily anything brand new, but their approach to it and the understanding of how this works is pretty unique, and it's only been around for roughly 40, 50 years at this point. And so effectively what NLP is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a study of patterns. And so the idea here is to take examples or case studies, if you will, from successful individuals in whatever field it may be. Of course, we're talking about healthcare industry and a lot of different areas, but whatever field it is, the focus is to find patterns with successful individuals in that field and be able to identify those patterns and then implement those patterns to be able to create success for oneself utilizing similar things. What Bandler and Grinder found over the course of exploring was they realized that there's neurological processes that take place within our neurology and within our minds that are fairly consistent across the human race. So one of the things that really speaks to NLP for me personally is that it's not necessarily like linguistic is the middle name. So yes, the way we speak to ourselves, the language we use absolutely is very important. Simultaneously, it's not just the things that we say to ourselves. A lot of people that I work with have done things like affirmations where you say things out loud that you want to believe. And yes, there is value to that, of course, and we know that that can be effective. However, coming into NLP and learning that, okay, there are some, and timeline therapy in particular is fascinating, but basically coming in and learning these techniques where it's like, okay, if you have to repeat to yourself, I am worthy 10 times a day for 6 months to a year before you actually begin to feel the belief shift and actually have that change. Now, that's valuable. I think everybody would agree that there's value in being able to shift those beliefs just through saying the words to yourself, I am worthy, right? However, coming in with NLP and learning that there's techniques where once some of the basic core beliefs and fundamentals about the process and about NLP and about the mind are established, you can literally take 5 to 10 minutes with some of these techniques and have that same shift that used to take 6 months to a year in a course of minutes or hours. So it's really fascinating. And there's a lot of people that have been trained in NLP. Tony Robbins is a big one who's definitely used a lot of NLP in his content. I have my issues with Tony's business practice and models. However, that said, the guy's affected positively tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions of people worldwide. So whether or not I agree with everything he does is irrelevant. I have a great deal of respect for the man. Ed Milet is another one who's been NLP trained. So a lot of these big folks that are notable in the self-empowerment or self-betterment, self-personal growth world have been trained in NLP and use it to their benefit. Now, NLP is also effectively, it's an understanding of how people think. And so that, of course, can be used nefariously. So there's a lot of people that are, say, pickup artists, right, to trying to meet girls in particular, and they'll use techniques like this to be able to instantly establish rapport and drop barriers, et cetera, which are all speaking to the unconscious frame of mind of that individual. And so learning that can, of course, be nefarious. These techniques have been used by the CIA, the FBI, to identify when folks are being honest or dishonest. There's a lot of ways that it can be used. And so one of my main goals with my clients is to make sure that everything we do is ethical and is it what I say ecological. And by that, I don't mean, of course, that it's like good for the environment. I mean that it checks in ecologically, that it's good for the the people surrounding you as well as the intention. So for example, I've had potential clients approach me and, all right, well, what's your goal? Well, if that person's goal is, I'm a car salesman and I want to crush the competition, I don't work with that individual. That doesn't mean I have anything against him. It's just that if his goal is I want to better my sales, I want to have, better client relationships, that's a very different approach than I want to beat every other sales guy. So it's important to me to make sure that it's ethical and it grows in a meaningful, positive way.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm relatively new to the NLP world. I'd say probably the last year or so. It's maybe two. It's been on my radar. I've been learning more about it. And as an English major originally, like obviously I love the idea of linguistics, right? And the words that we choose and how that affects our belief, our attitude, our mindset, our mood. It's becoming more and more and more important to me, the words that I use and how I choose to use them. And I think that has, like you said, it can be used nefariously for sure, but it can also be used very powerfully in a positive direction. And I think, more and more the way I see it, I can start utilizing this stuff in my teaching, right? In my educating, in getting students to like get motivated, to understand things better, to do the right things, to set them up for success. So, I'm excited to kind of
Yeah.
dive into the meat and potatoes of today to just kind of see like, you know, how do you view this stuff? Like where do you really see it being most effective with regards to how we think and the way the mind works?
Yeah, well, I'll preface it too with this. So again, father was a surgeon, so I grew up in a very scientific household, right? I mean, when I was writing papers for school, it was always, cite your sources, make sure that you understand where things are coming from. And I do think there's an awful lot of value in that. Simultaneously, I'm a recovering Catholic. I grew up in a Catholic household, so there was also faith as well. And so I've been blessed with this juxtaposition of both faith, which some people, agnostics, atheists might call woo-woo, and then of course being in a scientific household. So the ability to respect both and the value that they provide is key to what I do. I do try, and especially within this context, I think the scientific studies and the things that are actively seeable and demonstrable are incredibly important. So I'll reference as many as I can. And if I get any of the names or dates or anything wrong, just understand I do this from memory, but I'm happy to provide anybody anything that I mention. If you want, you can reach out to me directly, and I'd be more than happy to share those with you. But basically, where I would start is with a simple question, which is for your audience: are you aware that you have an unconscious mind? And I let that question percolate for a little bit, only because most of the time, especially within health circles, we view the term unconscious to be, knocked out, right? So we're maybe like had a head injury or, whatever it may be, sleeping even, right? Well, that's I want to be clear, that's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is the difference between what we refer to as human beings as the conscious mind, being our frontal cortex, the frontal lobe, which is where we exist egoically. And I don't mean ego as in like a negative, arrogant thing. I mean ego is like the self. So where I, as TJ, exist takes place in the frontal portion of my brain. Now, the unconscious mind exists in other portions of the mind or in other portions of the brain. So this takes place in the back portion of the mind, particularly the hippocampus is a big one. And we know this because when we hook people up to EEG machines and we ask them there's countless studies on this. You can watch different parts of the brain light up based on the questions that are asked or the inputs that are provided. So, for example, when you hook someone up to an EEG and you ask them to talk about themselves or talk about a memory that happened, that day, or solve a math problem, or talk about politics and what suggestions they might have to solve a given solution. All of those things take place in our conscious mind. Those happen in the frontal lobe. However, when you ask somebody something about emotion, right, specifically any emotion, whether it's being loved or fear or anxiety, sadness, any of these emotions, they all take place in the back portion of the mind. So to me and to NLP, what this means is that the unconscious is the exclusive domain of emotions. And one of the ways we can anecdotally prove that to ourselves is we can ask the question, when did you ever have to consciously think of an emotion? So if you've got children or like a wife or partner or family or whatever, have you ever had to consciously think about loving them, or do you just feel it? And generally, I would submit the answer is that we feel those emotions. So knowing that that's the case, we also can understand that those two things take place in separate portions of the mind. And so I think it's important to understand that because we have two different minds, we have the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, it's important to understand how they both work. Now, modern day mental health and therapy, counseling, psychology, psychiatry, etc., has largely been based on Carl Jung's work, who was a fascinating individual and incredibly intelligent. But Jungian psychology, of course, like anything, has its flaws. And one of the things that I think is very notable is that Carl Jung largely he discussed the unconscious mind. It was his, I would argue, his fascination. And I think that's largely where a lot of the unconscious, or they call it subconscious work, comes from. I'll also note I use the phrase unconscious because, as I said, the words we use are important, and the preface sub means, quite literally means under or less than. And I would submit that the unconscious mind is actually vastly more powerful than the conscious mind. And therefore, I don't use sub, I say unconscious, just to delineate and also give it the respect that I believe it deserves. So when you hear me refer to the unconscious mind, unconscious and subconscious, for all intents and purposes, are interchangeable in this conversation. But one of the things I'd like to really start with here, and I'll go ahead and pull this up and share my screen. So give me just a moment here.
And for those of you listening to the audio version of this, check out the YouTube channel for the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast so you can watch the video as well and see some of these demonstrations and the slides here that TJ's pulling up.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Scott. So as I go through this, I'll do my best to describe it for anybody listening. But one of the things that's crucial to understand within the process that I work at is what I call cause and effect. Now, there are multiple ways to exist within life, and I submit that in any given situation, we're going to exist at the effect of that external input or the external event, meaning that we are reacting to that event. So being at the effect of one's life is commonly modern day referred to as victimhood, right? Like, so you're a victim of your circumstances. This is a red flag for me, is like, oh, this happened to me, or somebody did this to me. Now, being at cause for your life means that what you're doing is you're actually saying, okay, what did I do to attract this into my life? And that can be an incredibly uncomfortable conversation. I also want to submit that fault or blame and responsibility are not connected. It's a complex equivalence to connect those together. And so what I mean by that is that, let's say that something does happen to you, right? There's maybe you had a car accident, right? Whatever it is, that did happen to you. Now, I'm not saying you were texting and driving. You may be just sitting at a stoplight, somebody ran into you. Not your fault. So it has nothing to do with fault. However, if you look at the situation as though you're a victim and you say, I'm at the effect of this, I have this injury or I have these insurance woes or whatever it is because this happened to me, I would submit that that's far less empowering, arguably more disempowering, than if you look at that same situation and say, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I take this? What's my responsibility in this situation? And so if you look at that specific situation and say, okay, well, you know what? I used to have a real frustration with the medical system, and now I don't have a choice but to use it. So I can take this time to delve into and learn that system better such that I have a better outcome. Or I can choose a more safe vehicle, or I can plan my routes accordingly. Let's say it was a snowy day, like I could have waited. Did I really need milk and eggs, right? Whatever it is, if you take responsibility, you're much more likely to gain growth from any given circumstance or given situation than if you take the victimhood role. So it's in a way, it's kind of that like bootstraps approach, but I don't really like that comparison only because it's not to say that you're at fault for anything. It's just to say that it's far more empowering to point the finger at yourself. And this is where, one of my sayings that I use regularly is, where you point your finger is where you send your power. Where you point your finger is where you send your power. So if you're pointing it in the mirror at yourself, you're going to keep a lot more power than if you point it somewhere else. So that's the first thing I want to get into. The next step, and this was explained to me a few years ago, and it really, really resonated with me. I was doing instructing in the driving world at the time, and I have yet to find an area where this does not apply to any phase of learning. So these are what I call the 4 stages or the 4 steps of learning. And effectively, you have the first stage, which is called unconscious incompetence. And I want to make note, incompetence here does not mean stupidity or lack of intelligence. It just means that you don't know what you don't know, right? So think every 17-year-old kid ever, right? It's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like, the
Yep.
less you know about something, the more confident you are. That first stage of unconscious incompetence, you don't know what you don't know. Well, whatever the topic is, once you learn a little bit about it and you have that oh moment where it's like, oh man, I really don't know anything about this, we call that conscious incompetence. That's where you become aware of your lack of education, lack of knowledge, lack of experience, and can therefore let some walls down and allow yourself to begin to learn the subject matter. Our third stage is what we call conscious competence. That's where we've effectively had that aha moment where it's like, oh, that's what I have to do. That's how this works. Okay. I still have to consciously think through the process as I'm going through it. It's just that now I know what needs to be done and what steps to take so I can get through it effectively. And then the fourth and highest stage, I would argue, is unconscious competence, meaning that it comes automatically. So in anything, you can go through these stages. So unconscious competence, unconscious incompetence being the first stage, the second stage being conscious incompetence, the third stage being conscious competence, and the fourth and final stage being unconscious competence. And that's how we learn anything. And we're all at varying degrees of this process throughout learning anything. So I think that's important just to understand by and large throughout this process. One of the other things that I'll go into here, we talked about NLP a little bit, and I want to spend a little bit of time just on the unconscious mind itself. So if we separate our mind as a whole integrated unit into the conscious on one side and the unconscious on the other, we've probably all heard the statement that we only use as humans about 10% of our brain. Well, I would argue that that's actually the conscious portion of our brain that we're able to use 10% of. I would also suggest that it's possible that the unconscious mind is actually the other 90% and it's always working in the background. So to give you an idea what takes place within your neurology, within your minds, I like to think about our mind as you can see in the slide if you're watching, as a glacier. We've all seen those images of how much of a glacier is underneath the surface of the water. It's vastly larger than what's above the water. And to be able to see this visually, that's how I think about the unconscious versus conscious mind. The conscious mind is what we see above the water, and the unconscious mind is what takes place below the surface. So the conscious mind consists of things like willpower, short-term memory, logical thinking, and critical thinking, as well as the egoic self, like I mentioned. And then the unconscious mind is things like the beliefs, and they can be beliefs that you hold about yourself or about the world around you. Emotions, as I mentioned, these are habits, values, your core values, whether they be loyalty, freedom, survival, whatever it is, doesn't really matter, but those values are very important as well. Reactions, long-term memory, imagination, intuition is a really important one. Sometimes in what I do get into a bit of the woo-woo. But for now, what I'd like to submit again is that the unconscious mind is vastly more powerful than the conscious mind. Between those two minds, we have what we call the critical barrier or the critical factor. And really what this is that barrier that we establish unconsciously to disconnect those two minds, or as I like to say, disintegrate. So I have a young daughter right now, and she's just over a year old. And watching her think, because she doesn't yet have the ability to utilize language, what is she thinking in? Because it's damn sure not English. So she thinks in emotions. And so when she sees something that she wants, she knows she wants it and she has that desire, that emotion of desire, right? But she can't really communicate super effectively how to do it. So if I don't give it to her, she starts crying. What I'm noticing is that it's this beautiful integration of the conscious and unconscious minds. Her conscious desires are directly tied to her unconscious emotional state. And so as we grow older, we slowly and consistently separate the conscious and unconscious mind. That's just part of being a human and part of our society as a whole. And so that critical factor, or that critical barrier between the two minds becomes bolder, stronger, and more influential the longer we're alive and the more aggressively, the more disintegrated our minds become. And so that becomes a key part of what we're doing. And largely it's to protect ourselves. So as I work with my clients and as I work on myself, what I've noticed is that I begin to reintegrate my conscious and unconscious mind to a degree. And when that happens, I become more susceptible to things like symbolism or music or content or what have you, because that critical factor becomes smaller and weaker, which can be a positive thing in a lot of ways, because you can be in better connection with your conscious and unconscious minds. However, it also means you're much more susceptible to influencing your unconscious. And so I'm much more careful now than I used to be about what types of music I listen to, the lyrics in those songs. I don't watch horror films or violent content anymore, really. I'm very, very careful about the books I read and the content that I consume, because I know that whether I admit it or not, it's going directly through that critical barrier into my unconscious mind. And so that's, to me, that's been fascinating to understand how powerful the unconscious is. And just as a quick point on this, we know without a doubt that many of the functions of the human body are controlled by the unconscious mind. And this is, quite honestly, to me, very simple to understand because of this. I've never once had to think about healing a paper cut. I don't have to sit there and consciously think, okay, I need to send resources to this paper cut from my body. My body does that automatically. My body automatically processes food. It heals from minor injuries. My blood pumps through my heart. My breathing takes place. Now, we know that, Buddhist monks are able to control with great, incredible ability their physical bodies as well. So can you do those things? Yes, absolutely. And yet you don't have to. Your unconscious mind's always running in the background, taking care of these things. So I like to look at this as sort of like an operating system on a phone, where you have an app is very specialized. Let's say you want to get on social media or check your bank account balance, right? You're going to go to an app that's very specific to that activity, which would be your conscious mind. And you're going to use it to focus on one specific task, which it does incredibly well. However, in the background, the whole operating system would be the unconscious mind, and it influences all of those apps, which is why when you update your operating system, you often find you have to update all of the apps to work with the new system. So it's very, very important to understand how powerful the unconscious mind is. The other thing I jump into right away, and I'll move to the next slide here. They call this the NLP communication model. I like to refer to it as what I call the filter system. And so the way that this works is an external event takes place, regardless of whatever that event is. To use the same one as we did earlier, let's say it was a car accident, right? Well, external event is perceived through our five senses, being visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. Through these five senses, our unconscious mind and conscious minds, of course, take in all of this data. And there is a study from the University of Pennsylvania that the specific numbers are less important to me. It's more the concept. But in this study, they said that we take in, as human beings, roughly 11 million bits of information or data per second. Now, quite honestly, how they achieved this astronomical figure is beyond me. I don't know. I have no idea how you would quantify or measure that, but it's a lot of data. And they also said that consciously, as human beings, we're only able to process roughly 126 bits per second. So what happens is our unconscious mind perceives all of the data around us. So just to use the visual elements, as I sit in this room, or as you sit there listening to this, all the things that you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch around you, your unconscious takes that data in. And through the processes of deletion, distortion, and generalization, which I'll get into in a minute, it decides which of those 11 million bits of data are important enough to present to us consciously as 126 bits to be able to process consciously. So our unconscious has to have this filter system to decide which bits of information are relevant and important enough to be presented as that small percentage, that fraction that actually comes to us consciously. And this filter system consists of things like, we have deletion, distortion, and generalization is the process, but that filter system consists of time and space, matter and energy, of course, language. We filter everything through language. Different languages perceive different things. Memories as well, decisions, our meta programs, which I can get into at another time, our values, our core values and beliefs, and of course, our attitudes as well. And then from the coloration that those filters provide of this external event coming in, we then create what we call an internal representation. And an internal representation is effectively what we build within our conscious minds to mean that to represent this event. So we have an internal representation of that event taking place. And we know that our internal representation also consists of an emotional state. That emotional state can also affect our physiology, which is why oftentimes you'll see Olympic athletes doing empowering poses. They'll put their arms above their head versus, the physiology of like crossing one's arms and being closed off. These are all unconscious methods of communication. And so, because our internal representation affects our emotional state and therefore affects our physiology and behavior, this also ends up creating actions that we put out into the world that go out and affect that external event. And this process, just like the movie Inception, it happens so fast and so fluidly that your mind doesn't even perceive it taking place. So, this all happens within an instant. And so the first understanding or the first step really is to understand that A, this is taking place. That's that first step of like, okay, now I'm at conscious incompetence. Now I know that this is taking place, so now I can learn about it. But most people are unaware that this is taking place, and they'll act from a place of they'll be at the effect of their life and play that victimhood role of like, oh, I don't know that this is taking place, so I'm just this happened and now I feel this way about it. So acknowledging and understanding that that process is taking place is a huge key to what it is that I do. Um, that filter system, basically what NLP allows us to do along with timeline therapy and certain elements of hypnosis as well, allows us to swap out filters, to tweak filters, and basically allow us to kind of play with our own neurology such that we can achieve different behavior and actions through the changing of internal representations and therefore emotional states and our physiology. So tweaking that filter system is basically what this entire process of neuro-linguistic programming is about.
Yeah. That is a lot to unpack there, my friend. So
Yes, it is.
let's go back to something you touched on in the very beginning, and that was, cause and effect, right? And how that, affects us based on how we handle it, right? So I like to think back to when I lost my dad, right? When he passed away, uh, I was working at a hospital where he passed away, and I was studying for my board exam for the third or fourth time. I was working as a PT tech. I had to pass the room where he passed away every day to clock in and clock out, and it really started wearing on me. And I really got to the point where I kept saying, why? Why me? Like, why did this happen to me? And then like, after doing a little bit of like self-discovery and starting to realize, that victim mentality and how useless it can be, I started more trying to frame it and think differently about it as far as like, why did this happen to me? Right. So, what am I supposed to learn from this? What am I supposed to gain from this? In hindsight, I wouldn't have met my wife, I wouldn't have had my kids, right? It wouldn't have, things would not have worked out the way they did. So, it makes sense, for me to try to reframe things. And especially after reading, Psycho-Cybernetics. Have you read that one by
I have not. No,
okay,
that's I'm gonna make a note though.
that's a good one. So Psycho-Cybernetics, I believe Maxwell Maltz, I think it is the guy's name. Regardless, he basically says like we can take a look at things that have happened previously in our life and reframe them to kind of gain power and control over how they make us feel, our emotions, et cetera, simply by, again, taking that different look as to like, why is this happening for me as opposed to why is it happening to me, right? And I think about that Jocko Willink TED Talk, right? It's extreme ownership, and I think that is a little bit extreme, right? Hence the name. But I also think that if we look at it as far as like, okay, yes, could I have gone a different way? Could, what am I to learn from this? What can I take away from this experience to make me a better person or a better, operator or whatever it may be, right? And so I've been trying to dive into the way the brain works and how it's kind of like the body's natural pharmacy, right? And we have, all of these natural drugs inside of us that are, up and down based on our, physiology and things that are going on around us. And it a lot of it is very, rudimentary in like the fact that it's fight or flight. And like you said, a lot of that stuff we can't control. However, the more we seem to be able to tap into the unconscious mind, we can actually start to affect some of those things a little bit easier, right? Or have a little more control over them than normally we would, right? So I think it's important to understand that I like the example of a roller coaster, right? Like when we're at the top, we're about to drop, we don't know if it's fear and we're scared or if we're excited and happy, right? It's the same amount of the same drug being released by our brain. And it kind of depends on how we frame the experience, you know? Are we like deathly afraid or are we really pumped and into it, you know? The body doesn't know the difference. So it's important, I think, for us to start framing those experiences on based on how we want the experience to go or the outcome we're trying to get. And I think, you know, the more we talk about this, it really makes me just amazed at how well that Disney Pixar movie Inside Out really
Yeah.
kind of took a lot of these thoughts and ideas and our beliefs and our values and how they're kind of working together inside the brain, you know? So take us to the next step here now. Tell us a little bit about how we tap into this stuff and what are some practices that we need to consider when looking at, you know, NLP and looking at this filter that we have to go through because essentially it's the reticular activating system that does the filtering for us, right? So dive into that a little bit and peel that apart for me a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned it perfectly. So the reticular activating system is within the context of what I'm sharing here. So there was that slide about the filter system, as I call it, and the reticular activating is the process through which our unconscious mind decides through deletion, distortion, and generalization which bits of that 11 million bits of data per second it's going to present for us for conscious processing. So, and to give a visual, because there's obviously a lot of visual learners in the world, if you imagine if a piece of data that comes in through your five senses is a toothpick, and you've got a dump truck of toothpicks showing up every second, and you can only grab a handful to process consciously, that's a massive amount of data that just effectively gets rejected. And so our reticular activating system is the system that allows our minds to choose which ones of those are relevant enough to be presented for conscious processing. So deletion is the biggest one for sure, because basically what that means is we take in that information, like for me, the color of this room, right? The temperature of the room that I feel, right? These are all things that I'm receiving here every moment, and yet I'm just deleting them because they're irrelevant to our conversation. So all of this data that comes in, we largely just ignore, we delete. Then there's distortion, which really is just taking something that we feel is important enough. We're not sure what it is, and so our unconscious tries to make it something that it may be that is familiar to us. There's a great parable or story from a long time ago where a guy was walking down a path and he saw a snake out of the corner of his eye and jumped out of the way, only to realize that it was actually just a piece of coiled rope. So it was something that he was presented, it was distorted to mean something that it didn't really mean, but he still had the same reaction because the unconscious wasn't 100% sure what it was. So it kept him safe from nothing that was dangerous. But so that's basically distortion. And then generalization is taking, it's very similar to distortion in that it takes information that it understands and it says, okay, this is like this. And so I'm going to group them all together. I'm going to generalize that this is all the same type of data. Um, those three processes allow us to determine which things we need to devote our very impressive and yet still limited conscious processing power. And so to demonstrate this, one thing I like to do is ask somebody, you know, when the last time you bought a new car was. Like, so for you, Scott, what was the last new vehicle that you got?
No, unfortunately, it was a minivan.
What
Not
what kind?
a Honda Odyssey.
Okay, sweet. So
Yeah.
when you bought your Odyssey, did you all of a sudden start noticing more Honda Odysseys driving around on the road?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Right? And
absolutely.
so
Mostly because
that
I don't like minivans and I don't like Honda Odysseys, but
sure.
my wife
I was a
wanted one,
race
and
car driver,
so
man. It's not at the top of my list either.
no.
But that said, well, to be fair, you actually picked probably the coolest one. But that said, it's not that everybody out there went and just simultaneously bought a bunch of Honda Odysseys. It's just that you hadn't been paying attention to the ones that were out there before. And now, because you've spent all this time and energy focused on the vehicle, buying it, you're driving it, it's part of your life now. Your reticular activating system is saying, okay, it's important for you. So we're going to go ahead and present you when we notice
Yeah,
there's another Honda Odyssey driving around. That's a really great way to understand because your objective material world hasn't necessarily changed, but the way that you perceive it consciously does because
yeah,
your unconscious presents you specific information.
yeah,
So the reticular activating system is fascinating because what it does is it's programmable. And what it does is it gives us confirmation bias exists, and so it looks for things that it already believes to be important or believe to be true. And so one of the things that you see, like right now, regardless of where anybody is on politics, that's not what I would get into, but what I would submit is that if you have spent, let's call it the last 10 years, absolutely loathing and detesting Donald Trump, okay, fine. Believe me, I can respect that. Simultaneously, most of what you're going to see that Trump does, you're going to see the bad things about it because your reticular activating system has gotten to the point that you're going to see the bad portions of what he's doing. And on the flip side, the MAGA people are going to see all the great things that he's doing, right? So it's we all do this. And so to acknowledge that that's what's taking place and that we've trained our reticular activating system to show us certain things, of course, means that that's what we're going to continue to see. And this is why, without going into a great length or going into great length in this, I think it's so sad and unfortunate that in society we push victimhood. Like right now, it's really, really valuable to be a victim. And while I do fully support the idea of encouraging marginalized and underrepresented communities to be represented, I also think there's a big danger in telling people that they've been victims of whatever it is, because once you teach people once you teach your reticular activating system to see ways in which you've been victimized in the past, it's going to continue to show them more and more. And so, you can see this in all kinds of things, like when our country elected Obama in 2008, if you look at like the old Google searches for the word racism before Obama's candidacy in 2008, they really were pretty low. And then during the candidacy and during his presidency, they spiked and they've been way higher than they were before then. Now, does that necessarily mean that anything in the country objectively changed? Or is it just that people are looking for it and are more attuned to seeing racism and things? So by the way, racism's real. There's no excuse for it. I'm not condemning or condemn, like I'm none of that. I'm not getting into that. I'm just pointing out that noticing things through our reticular activating system is really what's powerful about this conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of just put it into the text, like the context of like healthcare a little bit. Lorimer Moseley is a pain scientist, right? And he has a similar story about a snake, right? Like if you're walking through, a trail, and you see a stick or whatever, right? And you think it's a snake, right? And you jump out of the way, right? Like he uses the example that he was walking and brushed a stick and thought, "Ow, oh, a snake bit me," right? And went back and looked and said, "Oh, it's just a stick, no big deal." Right? But then fast forward, a couple months later and there's an actual snake, right? If you had that experience in the past, you're more likely to kind of brush it off and be like, "Oh, it's no big deal, probably just a stick again," when in reality it's an actual snake, right? So like it makes sense that our body's trying to protect us and our mind's trying to filter and give us the information that it needs. And so it's like a real life algorithm, right? Nowadays with social media and all the apps, like, we get fed and we get shown things that we like and that the algorithm thinks we want to see more of, right? So it's again reinforcing the things that you want to see or that it thinks that you want to see or thinks that it's important to you, right? So it's really just like the algorithm of our mind, right? And I think it's important to recognize that, like you said, go way back to the beginning. It's important what we feed our mind, and that can definitely influence us. I think, at the unconscious level, if you're consistently feeding your mind garbage, you're probably going to get garbage output, right? Garbage
Yeah.
input, garbage output,
Garbage in, garbage out. Absolutely, man. Yeah. And by the way, the metaphor of the algorithm is absolutely perfect, man. That's beautifully said. That's exactly what it is, because it's really your reticular activating system is always, and your unconscious mind are always trying to determine what is important to you, and therefore utilizing that to decide which bits of information to present you. And so that process is ongoing all the time, and it's really it can be affected, right? It can be tweaked with intention. And so I have some very simple techniques that I use, which we can go into if we have time. But there's simple ways to basically change that for your own benefit. The easiest way is to just consciously make an effort to look for things that you desire to see more of. So, for example, if you want to feel more gratitude in your life, make a daily habit of writing down 3 things that you were grateful for that day. And over the course of, usually a couple few weeks, your unconscious will start to realize, oh, okay, this person, you're looking for more things to be grateful for. So now I'm going to show you those things in the moment. And then you'll start to notice all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, I'm really grateful for that. Oh, wait a minute. I wouldn't have felt that before. Like now, oh, it's working. So yeah, we can tweak our reticular activating systems consciously, which is a fascinating concept to me, that we can consciously tweak our unconscious mind to have it work better for us. And that's the entirety of what NLP and timeline therapy are about.
Yeah, and I've told people this millions of times, but it took me a handful of times to pass my board exam, right? And when I finally did pass it, the only thing different, I knew the content, right? I didn't know I had ADHD at the time, but that's, it makes sense now in hindsight. But when I looked at what I was doing different, the only thing I did differently was I started journaling, right? Which I hate. I hate journaling, even as an English major. But I did. I started writing down 2 or 3 things that were, I was grateful for, like a gratitude type journal. And then 2 or 3 things that I had to get done, needle movers to get done for that day. And that was my journaling every morning. I started affirmations, positive affirmations, telling myself that, I knew the content. I was going to ace this test on the next time. I was going to, become a physical therapist, et cetera, et cetera. I added visualization, right? And these are just like some of Hal Elrod's like miracle morning type stuff,
Yeah, I
right?
love that.
Yeah, it's just like stuff that I started doing because I had to do something different. What I was doing wasn't working, right? So I just added these things and did visualization and affirmations and gratitude and journaling and meditation and did were those the reason I passed? I don't know, maybe, but I mean, it didn't hurt, that's for sure. I felt much better as an individual and a human being by the time I had finally passed and like overcome that that dragon and slayed that dragon. So to this day I still do those things because I do feel that it's beneficial, right? Like I said, it's not a negative, or at least I haven't experienced it to be a negative yet, so why not try it, no matter how woo woo you think this stuff is, like you have to kind of give some of it credence because again, if it works for you, you got to give it a shot, you got to go for it, and
Yeah,
just try it out.
exactly. And that's the question that I would ask with a lot of people in the medical world, particularly because I shouldn't say we, because I am not part of the medical world, but when you spend so much time, 4 years in med school, and then if you're a doctor, you're going to residency, you're going to med school, residency, internship, all these things, you have the elements of the sunken cost fallacy, meaning that, okay, this, I've poured myself, my energy, my life, my time into this specific outcome. Therefore, it's really, really, it builds what we call that box, right? So the inductive thinking of anything within this box that I am part of, that I believe in, that I've ascribed to, that's the right answer, or that's necessary, that's how it should be done. Thinking deductively becomes more and more different, or more and more difficult, rather, the more time we spend inside that box. So the more energy you devote to one particular outcome or one particular path in life, the harder it's going to be for someone to branch off from that particular outcome, from that particular path. And so I would submit to anybody listening that might be curious about some of this. There are some studies that back up what I'm saying. Simultaneously, some of it is merely anecdotal, right? So if you find something that's valuable, like you mentioned Hal Elrod's Miracle Morning, which I've been doing for almost a decade now, probably like 8 years or so. And if you find value in that, and that's helping you, in whatever way, then what more evidence do you require?
Right.
And so it really becomes a matter of looking at it yourself and saying, what value do I find from this? And it's there's no right or wrong. I submit that the smartest unconscious in the room for my client is theirs. Who the heck am I to tell somebody what's going on within their neurology? My job is to ask questions and hold space for people such that they feel comfortable being vulnerable and, crucially, honest with themselves. Because you can lie to me, that's fine. I'm not going to know the difference, but you're not going to get the result. So it really becomes this thing of like, well, if I see value from it, even if there's no studies proving that it's true, is it still valuable? Well, if you're getting
Yeah.
value out of it, then I would argue that yes, it is valuable, right? And so we also know that the placebo effect, like you
Right.
and I discussed the other day, is real. We can demonstrate that. So even if it's only that you're believing something slightly different, if that's changing things for you in a positive way, we know that even if it is just the placebo effect, that there's still value in it. So again, it really is a matter of what you perceive to be valuable. And I certainly am not the one who can tell somebody that NLP or timeline therapy or the big thing these days is ayahuasca or any other modality. I can't tell you what's going to be valuable to each individual. I can submit that it's better to try them and see what results you personally experience and build from there. So it's, NLP was huge for me. It's been huge for a lot of my clients. And I also understand that it's not the only methodology or the only modality out there. So whatever it is for you that seems to work, it's just a matter of toying with things. And I submit that looking at life as a game to be played and looking at things as though we have an opportunity to try different things and see what works best for us such that we can create the outcomes we desire is far better than any pathway that has like a set stepping stone of rules, right? Like you do this, you go to this school, you get this class, this degree, this certification, this license, and then you'll become this. That's fine. There's value in that. And simultaneously, there's also value in figuring out what it is that's going to lead you to your own outcome, whatever that is on your own. So they're not mutually exclusive. You can certainly do both. Um, I do think, and I'd like to mention a couple things just on the unconscious mind in general, if that's all right.
Yeah, please.
So, what does the unconscious mind do? What are its prime directives? Well, I personally, I'm a man of God. I read the Bible. Now that said, like my practice, I work with anybody. I don't care what you believe. I respect everybody's model of the world. And it really doesn't matter because it's not a faith-based practice. I just utilize that because it's important to me. But I will tell you this, I do believe in creationism. Simultaneously, I also believe in evolution. I have been to the Galapagos Islands. I have seen examples of evolution. And to me, the idea that they're mutually exclusive is garbage. Because in Genesis, in the Bible, they say that in 7 days, God created the earth. In 6 days, he created the earth and man. And then on the seventh day, he rested. Well, in truth, who the hell am I to determine that God experiences time in the same way that I do? Like maybe one day is a million years. So again, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. So because I believe that evolution is real, and I know that that's real from all the evidence and studies that we've seen over the years in Darwin's work, what's incredible is that you can also believe that our unconscious mind evolved for our own benefit. So if your unconscious mind didn't have your own survival and reproduction and the continuation of the species, if those were not part of its primary goals, we wouldn't be here. So, you mentioned the neurotransmitters earlier, right? So dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, all these chemicals that course through our brains and our bodies all the time. If those were not present, particularly dopamine, which we know has a huge connection to addiction, you get floods of dopamine when you do things that benefit the species, right? So, for example, when you reproduce, when you have sex, you get a huge boost of dopamine. When you eat sugary or fatty foods, which 10,000 years ago was a big deal because you just needed calories to survive, right? Nowadays, very different conversation, of course. But when you take these activities, you do these things that many, many years ago would help perpetuate your own existence and continue the species, you got a flood of dopamine, which helped you wanted to do it more. And so these things, I believe, were created by the unconscious mind to give us this motivation. And so when your unconscious mind installs let's say a belief, right? It's doing so with your benefit at heart or in mind. So I had a client, for example, I like sharing this story. I shared it with you the other day, but I had a client who was 67, 68 years old, and her husband had passed away a few years before we started working together, and he had a very successful business. I think eight-figure business. And she was consistently making well over 7 figures a year just herself personally. And she could not hang on to money. She could never save money like her entire life. And even though she had taken control of the company and, 2 to 3x it in the time period that she'd been in charge, she could not save money to save her own life. And so when I was working with her, what ended up happening was through the course of questioning things, when we did some timeline therapy, and she ended up going back to this event when she was 5 years old, where she had her 5 year birthday, and her grandparents had given her a $5 bill, which 60 years ago was a significant chunk of change, especially for a 5 year old. And so she was really excited about it. She was sharing this with me, and she said that she remembered being excited to go get, I think it was a doll or something that she wanted. and as any kid would do. And so her parents, who were devoutly Christian, said, well, that's great of you, but if you were a good person, you donate that to, the collection plate at church so it can go to people who are more unfortunate than you, and be able to give back to the community. Now, I would argue that that's a beautiful sentiment to teach a young person. Unfortunately, what we found out she had actually installed unconsciously is that to be a good person, she couldn't hold on to money. And so this belief had been present in her neurology for 60 years, to the point that even as a very successful, entrepreneur herself, she could not hold on to money. So we went back, and now here's the thing. How could I have possibly known that? She said she hadn't thought about that in decades, but it came up because timeline therapy gave her unconscious the ability to clearly present things for resolution and a method with which to do so, such that we were able to remove that belief that at one point in time was there to protect her. It was there to help make sure she was a good person. And so, get the approval of her parents and all these other things. So it was a decision made by her unconscious that was there for her benefit. And unfortunately, it was just installed in the operating system and ran for 60 years and now is no longer serving her. So we were able to go back, remove that belief, replace it with a more empowering one. And suddenly, I think a few months ago, she called me. She's like, hey, I just passed 6 figures in my savings account. I've never done that. It's working. Thank you. So and that literally, that process, yeah, we had a conversation for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, and then about 15 minutes of working through the timeline therapy. So in an hour, maybe a little more than that, call it 2 hours, she was able to release 60 years of programming that then her unconscious was like, oh, okay, this is no longer present, so we don't have to do this anymore. And so it's fascinating to know how impactful changing our unconscious things, our beliefs and decisions can be.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's releasing those blocks that we don't even know exist, right? Or haven't thought about, like you said, in decades. Because, I think a lot about money mindset, right? And you hear like cliche phrases we've used, like save your pennies for a rainy day, and oh, you should definitely, save your money, don't give it away. That kind of like greed and like all these things that like can impact how you feel about money today. Like if you, came from a family that didn't have much, and you were always, had your parents saying, "Oh, well, we can't afford that," or "Oh, don't ask for something like that," or "Oh, it's not payday yet. I can't afford to do that." Like instead of like, holding on and bringing those along with us, sometimes we have to actually stop and release those things. And sometimes they even get as bad as trauma, right? Like you can have traumas that cause blocks that you don't even think about, and it's caused this subconscious or unconscious block that we have to release. And then, like you said, it becomes a matter of then empowering them with something else to anchor to or something else to hold on to then be able to move forward and move past it. So money mindset is definitely a big one that I've seen in a lot of people that, are afraid to start businesses or, don't know where to start. You got to have the right mindset before you even try to move forward, or it's going to be a disaster. So
Yeah,
I
yeah, I
see that.
agree, man. And I think there's definitely there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I completely agree. And the other part of it that I would add too is that when you have a presenting problem, let's say that it's the fear of starting a business, for whatever reason, that in my belief and largely in therapy and counseling, the belief is that the presenting problem is never actually the problem. There's something
Yeah,
underneath it
sublevel.
that's causing that problem. And this is where there becomes a disconnect from like traditional medicine to new age medicine or Eastern medicine or the woo woo or whatever people want to call it. But what I notice is that by and large, we can talk about insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and all the influences in the medical system ad nauseum. But what we seem to do, in my opinion, in the West is we address the symptom. So if you have high cholesterol, here's a pill for that, right? They don't say, well, you could lower your cholesterol by having a gym membership and eating healthier and taking care of the root problem, which is your diet, right? And so that's a great metaphor for what we do with our unconscious mind as well, where we say like, well, a common one I deal with entrepreneurs is like, well, why don't I take the steps and actions that I know I need to do to achieve a desired outcome, whether that be more money or starting a business or what have you? How come I know what I need to do, but I just don't do it? And that frustration can build and can cause all kinds of self-destructive behavior. I would submit that when that takes place, the symptom is that you're not actually doing what you need to do. There's likely a belief or a core value or something neurologically present that's underneath it and is thereby what I aim to get at, such that when you blow that piece out, everything above it is affected. When you get rid of the foundation of a home, that home ceases to exist. So it's really the ability to acknowledge there's more depth in everything that we do as human beings than we really have an understanding for. And obviously there's exceptions to that with people who are experts in this field, but most of us just kind of operate on the surface level. And when we begin digging, it can get really uncomfortable. I can't tell you how many tears I've seen shed, how many times like I've had difficult conversations with clients. I mean, tough love is valuable to a certain extent, but I don't generally operate that way because it's not me doing the work. You have to do the work on yourself. It's your unconscious mind. And if you're uncomfortable doing it, great. That means you're getting somewhere that your unconscious is trying to protect you from. So if you're digging and you're like, I don't like this. This is really uncomfortable. Good. Keep going because you're almost there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a fascinating time. Um, the unconscious mind. Can I run through a few more things there?
Yeah, please.
All right, perfect. So the prime directives of the unconscious mind. And again, this is not an all exhaustive list, but this is just a good idea of what it does. We know that it stores memories, right? We don't consciously hang on to all of our lives' memories. They're stored in the unconscious, and they can be stored in temporal terms, meaning that they're stored in relation to time, and they can be stored in atemporal terms, meaning they might be stored in relation to like emotion. Or some people remember things by significant events that they've had in their life. So they remember things based on like what part of the world, like a physical location that they lived in. But whatever it is, our unconscious stores memories. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, it's the exclusive domain of emotions. It also organizes your memories in a manner that allows it to present it to you. And one of the things that timeline therapy does is it provides a clear, concise direction and program for the unconscious to present these to you consciously. Because most of us walking around do not have a clear, concise method for our unconscious to present us memories. Where it's like you might have something happen to you randomly and be like, whoa, I just had a memory from like high school. Like, why the hell, where did that come from? I've never thought about that in 20 years. But those types of things that come up, that's your unconscious giving you something for a reason. I don't pretend to know what the reason is, but I do know that it came from somewhere and it didn't just float out of the ether. So it stores your memories. It also represses memories with unresolved negative emotion. So this is like the repressed memory thing most of us are familiar with. So a lot of times, like people, if they have traumatic experiences or what have you, their unconscious will just repress them and then they don't think about them, and it can still impact their daily lives. It will also keep the repressed emotions repressed for your protection, which is the whole reason it's doing that. So you're not constantly living in a state of fear or trauma or whatever it may be. It runs the body, as we mentioned. So it has a blueprint of the body now and of the body in perfect health. And it's always trying to adapt what you have now to get closer to the idea of perfect health, which is why, again, as a race car driver, when I put good fuel in my car, it runs a lot better than if I put garbage in it. So if you feed your body properly, you're going to get a better output because you have the better fuel to be able to devote those resources to wherever it needs to be. And the unconscious is in charge of that process. It also preserves the body, so it does its best to maintain the integrity of the body. Like you get tired at the end of a long day, and you're getting those symptoms from where? You don't consciously think, boy, I've had a long day. I better start getting tired. It comes from somewhere. Yes, it can be physical exhaustion and chemical reactions within the brain. Simultaneously, your unconscious can present those to you because it says you need to get some rest. It's also a highly moral being. So the unconscious is a highly moral being. And I want everybody to understand that the morality I'm talking about here has nothing to do with society and what society believes is moral. Crucially, this is the morality that you were taught and that you accepted to be true. This is the morality you were taught and accepted to be true, regardless of what that is. There's no judgment. So you mentioned earlier, Scott, somebody that maybe had a rough upbringing. One of their pieces of their morality could be that survival is extremely important. That could be a core value or a core belief for them. And you can't say that that's good or bad. It just is. And so, whereas somebody maybe like myself who grew up, very, very comfortable and safe, and I'm super grateful to my family for providing me that, I didn't have that. And so, whoever it may be, your morality is what you're taught and what you're accepted, and therefore that can affect everything that you do because that becomes part of your unconscious filter system. Next, your unconscious enjoys serving and it needs clear directions to follow. I like to think of our unconscious as like a dog or like a very young child, right? And so it's always, it wants to make you happy. It wants you to be successful. It wants you to do well because it is you. So a lot of people hear me talking about the unconscious mind as though it's another person, and that's only because it's easier for me to explain. It's just that obviously it's a portion of us. And so it wants to serve us, and that's what it's trying to do at all times. It's just that it may not have clear enough directions and understand that some of the things it's doing might be deleterious or negative to us. So in my case with my client with the $5 bill on her birthday, the belief was to make her a good person. So her unconscious mind gave her that belief that holding on to money would make her a bad person to make her a good person. It's just that it ended up not serving her in the long run. So again, it enjoys serving, but it needs clear directions to follow. Few more of them. It controls and maintains all of our perceptions, which is the basis for perception is projection. A lot of people know the word projection and that like you're projecting your own things onto somebody else. Understand that yes, that can be true. And simultaneously, for you to perceive something, it already has to be present within you. If you're at that first stage of learning where you don't know what you don't know, you couldn't possibly perceive it. So there's a great movie out there where basically the premise of the film, I'm forgetting the name, forgive me, but the premise of the film is that no one can lie. They've never lied. And there's one guy that figures out how to lie and he can get whatever he wants. Well, basically, that's what's happening with perceptions, because if you don't know what lying is, you can't perceive that somebody might be lying to you. So everything that you perceive someone may be doing to you is you projecting something within you onto them. That doesn't make you wrong, by the way. It just means that it's something present within you. And so acknowledging that about ourselves, I think, is really important. And that all it takes place within the unconscious mind and our intuitions. Our unconscious generates, stores, distributes, and transmits energy. That's the basis of how we heal things. It maintains instincts and crucially generates habits. So all habits are unconscious. We have to repeat them enough to be able to create those habits. Your unconscious needs repetition until a habit is installed. And it's programmed to continuously seek more and more. And this, again, like from the evolution standpoint, just makes sense to me, because if you came across if you're 10,000 years ago and you're living in a small tribe, if you came across like a big bush of berries, that was great for the village. Well, then just because you picked all those berries doesn't mean you suddenly don't want any more berries. Your unconscious is going to go, we need to go find more. There must be more in this area. That helped keep us alive and searching for more. So this is also, unfortunately, the basis of greed, which is why we see when people get incredibly successful and wealthy, regardless of your opinion on millionaires and billionaires, regardless of your opinion on that, the point is they're generally seeking more and more. This is all unconscious and from our deep history and evolution. It also, the unconscious functions best as a whole integrated unit, meaning that if we can reintegrate our conscious and unconscious minds to work better together instead of battling with one another, you're going to have a far better experience throughout the course of your life, I would submit. Your unconscious is symbolic, meaning it processes symbols, which is why as you're driving on the highway and you see a highway sign, that may have like a right arrow, you know that the exit's going to be to the right. You don't have to think about that process. You just learn symbols and then you see them. And that also is why it's very important to be aware of the content that we consume, because there's symbolism in everything, whether it's metaphorical or literal or visual, whatever. It still can cause us to receive things that we may or may not want to receive. And lastly, a couple really important ones. It takes everything personally. Our unconscious mind is the deepest, most connected form of ourselves. And so everything that is said to us, the unconscious mind takes personally, right? Now, it may not be intended that way, but intent from the person submitting it has nothing to do with how it's received. So understand that anything presented to you you are going to take it personally. And then you have the ability to recognize that and say, okay, this is not directed at me. This is about something else. But intuitively, naturally, we're going to take everything personally because that's a survival mechanism. It works on the principle of least effort. So just like water and electricity, neurology finds the easiest path. So many of us may have heard the phrase, the neurons that fire together wire together. And that's true, which it's the basis of habit. So the more often you use a particular string of neurons, the more ingrained it's going to get because it's easier for those pathways to fire. And then finally, and this is my personal favorite, your unconscious mind does not process negatives. So I'll say that again. Your unconscious mind does not process negatives. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, when I say not or don't, that's not what you hear. What you actually hear is what I said after that word. So the way and this is a real simple test. If I ask everyone listening, if I say, don't think about a blue tiger, every single person listening got some sort of image for a brief moment of a blue tiger. But I said, don't think about that. So in truth, what we get, the negatives that we say, the focus is still on the thing that we say, which is why when I'm talking to clients, I make sure to stress, say it how you want it. Because oftentimes what you hear broke people all the time, like, I'm tired of being broke. I'm sick of not having any money, right? I'm tired of living paycheck to paycheck. Okay, I get that. We've most of us have done that. I definitely have. In truth, though, your focus and your unconscious is still hearing broke, paycheck to paycheck, being out of money, right? Instead of saying, I want to be financially secure, I want to be wealthy, I want to be rich, I don't care what it is. Say it how you want it, because ultimately the neurology that we contain is what the way that we speak to ourselves. And so while this may be a simple concept, oftentimes you'll find yourself, when you notice this, you'll hear yourself do it all the time. And by the way, I do on a regular basis. It's almost impossible to avoid just because of the way the English language is structured. You'll catch yourself regularly saying like, oh, I don't want to do this. Okay, well, when you hear yourself say that, rephrase it to say what you want. Like with a little kid, don't play in the street. What's the first thing they do? They run into
Yep.
traffic, right? But if you say stay in the yard, you're much more likely to have that outcome because that's what their unconscious hears. So again, those are some real basic things that the unconscious is in charge of regulating and its primary directives, which again, the gist of it is that it's all there for our benefit. Now, how do we utilize this information? Assuming this all resonates, or even most of it resonates with people. Utilizing this is fairly straightforward, and it starts with a very simple conversation. And it's a conversation with yourself. It's a conversation with your unconscious mind. I talk to myself all the time, which might sound crazy to some people, but the truth is you have to have communication, right? And because we have a conscious and unconscious minds, and because they are separate and exist in different places of our brain, the communication between the two, by and large, doesn't exist. They just kind of operate on their own. So if you begin communicating with your unconscious mind, consciously communicating with your unconscious mind, you will get answers. You ask it questions and it will give you answers. And sometimes it's going to get them wrong. I have asked my unconscious mind what the lottery numbers are going to be. And guess what? It got them wrong because
Yep.
that's ridiculous for me to expect, right? I'm a human being. I am not the almighty. But that said, asking yourself simple questions like, hey, unconscious mind, what emotion are we feeling right now? And if you trust that instant reaction, the instant answer that you get could even be jargon when you first start doing this. But when you get that action, when you get that immediate response, that's going to be true because there's no faster response that we know of within your body than the communication with yourself. The crucial problem that a lot of folks run into when they start doing this is they'll consciously analyze the unconscious response. And so when you say like, well, what emotion are we feeling right now? And it's your immediate reaction is fear. And then consciously you're like, well, I don't feel afraid, but like, what is like what could be making me afraid? Well, I don't, okay, so it's not fear, it's like some, is it anxiety, like is it I don't know what it is. That conscious filtration that's gobbledygook. That's you trying to understand it. And I would submit that releasing the desire to understand every single thing that takes place is far more important to be able to trust those answers than it is to understand everything that you get. And this is where some folks in the medical community kind of they struggle with this a little bit, because we all want the scientific proof. We all want the studies. We want to verify things scientifically. But what if the scientific proof is impossible to measure? What if there are things like you mentioned with Hal's Miracle Morning that you can feel and you can experience personally that are beneficial to you that just simply can't be measured or quantified? Are those things still valid? Of course they are. So if that's the case and you're getting honest answers from your unconscious, you know it's coming from somewhere. So I would offer that trusting the communication with and from your unconscious mind is the best way to begin to reintegrate and build rapport with your unconscious mind. We spend most of our lives disintegrating and disconnecting from our unconscious. And yet we all know that feeling of when we walk into a room and we're like, something's off here. This
Yeah.
doesn't feel right. But that comes from somewhere. That comes from the unconscious mind. And yet we all know the trust your gut thing. Like every doctor in the world has done that at some point and said, like, the normal methodology is not going to work for this person. I need to do something different. And so like trauma surgeons, like my father who did that for a long time, you have to learn to trust that gut experience. And that relationship with your unconscious will serve you far, far better in a lot of situations. It's just really uncomfortable consciously, because what that means is you're allowing some of the conscious control to be delegated to the unconscious, and that can be really uncomfortable when you're first beginning, because it feels like something else is in charge of you. But oftentimes when we listen to our hearts, or when we listen to our guts, or listen to our unconscious, however you want to phrase it, is when we get the best results.
Man, what a way to wrap that up. That just put a nice little bow on top of things right there. And it made me think like, yeah, if I want to be the best clinician that I can be, I have to kind of start within the box and deductive reasoning and what I've been taught. But also, if I want to take it up a notch, I have to be open to the experiences of knowing when something doesn't feel right, right? Instinct, gut, heart, whatever it is that you believe, and then being able to let go of that a little bit and be like, hey, I don't know, but it's worth a shot, or hey, I may have to come at this a different way, and that's okay. I mean, physical therapists will understand this, a lot, because we try things all the time and they don't work. So then we've got to pivot and come up with a different plan of care or a different approach to it. We adapt things a lot, whether it be equipment or exercises, plan of care, whatever. There's a lot of trial and error involved. If a person can't do a certain exercise in a certain way, we come up with a different way or a different approach or a different exercise to get the same result and the same outcome. So it's, again, you and I talked about this the other day, but it's living in that gray, that literal ability to just live in the ambiguity, right? Like comfortableness of ambiguity and being okay with that.
Yeah.
The more you can do that, the more you can start to give things up to the unconscious mind, right? And trust it a little bit and realize, oh, that was a really neat thing that came together when I started thinking about the idea and how to approach it. Wasn't too sure about it, had a gut intuition, went with it, and it worked, you know? So I think at the very least, I think it takes being open-minded to this and working on trying to tap into the unconscious mind more. And TJ is going to be doing a deeper dive on this stuff with the Metacognition of Leadership Institute folks. So for more on that, just shoot us a message or a DM on any of the socials at HET Podcast. We'd love to have you in on that to kind of hear more of this and learn more of this and how to kind of start implementing it and applying it to your life. But TJ, thank you so much, man, for your time, for coming on here, for sharing your knowledge on this stuff. Like I said, really fascinating. We ask each of our guests this one final question, and I'd love to hear your take on this. But if you could change one aspect of higher education, what would you change and how would you change it?
Oh man. So I have a lot to say on higher education, but my immediate reaction is I'm going to try to set a good example here. So this is me trusting what immediately came, which would be presenting the idea of the existence of the unconscious mind to people in higher education. That doesn't mean going into all the details and, official training and anything, but just understanding that it exists, what
Awareness,
it
yeah.
is, and how it serves you. Because truthfully, the what's interesting, like I have a degree. I have a degree in film and photography from Montana State University, and it's hanging in Colorado at my parents' house. But at my house, the only thing that I display with pride is my certification as an NLP trainer. So the thing that really, really changed my life in such a profound way was understanding how I think, and therefore, because I'm a human and I'm connected to every other human in the world, how other people think as well, and how those neurological processes take place. It has fundamentally reshaped the way I look at the world, my relationships with myself, not least of all, and of course with those around me. So yeah, I think just a knowledge that the unconscious mind is real, and how it affects our daily lives. I think I would love to see that in higher education.
Yeah, I love that. Where can people reach out to you? Where can they find you if they have follow-up questions or they just want to see more about what you're doing these days?
Yeah, well, easiest way right now on Instagram is at TJFry406. That's TJFRY406. You can shoot me a DM if you're interested. I also have the website tjfry.com. I'm currently building that again. We're going to relaunch that here shortly. So if you go there and you see a construction message or something, just know it's coming. But by the time this airs, it may already be out. So yeah, tjfry.com, or just any of the social medias, mostly Instagram and YouTube, TJFry406. And anybody that wants to chat more or learn more, by all means, shoot me a message. I love conversations, and especially if something didn't resonate with you, or you want to understand it a little more, or you want to push back, like let's talk about it, because that's how these conversations are how this stuff gets out there and how people can learn about themselves more. So I enjoy it. I welcome it.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance, right? Like we need some conversation and pushback sometimes. We don't want to be in that echo chamber all the time with a bunch of yes men, right? We
Yeah,
want to have good
comfortable, but
conversation.
yeah,
Yeah.
the echo chambers are very comfortable, but they unfortunately they don't challenge us and push us out of our comfort zone to grow as much. So yeah, Scott, thank you so much for having me, man. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for letting me ramble a little bit and get some of those ideas out. And I hope y'all enjoyed it. And I'm really looking forward to when we do the deeper dive.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll put those links in the show notes so they're easy to find for everybody. TJ, can't thank you enough, man. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, man.